Hello, friends. On this glorious day in drink history, we catch up with an old friend. Ronnie Cox is the Brand Heritage Director for Spirits at Berry Brothers in Rudd in London, which is quite possibly the oldest wine and spirits merchant in the world. And when it comes to single malt whiskey, his eloquence and passion are surpassed only by his knowledge and experience. Mr. Cox and his iconic red socks can be found traveling the world, spreading his whiskey wisdom and sharing thirsty stories accumulated over a long career spent in this fine culture of spirits, with the Glenrothes Single Malt whiskey out of Speyside being the star of the show. He's a treasured part of our spirited family, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have him on this broadcast. Let's do this. This episode of the Educational Drinking Show is sponsored by Number 3 London Dry Gin. The folks at Berry Brothers in Rudd collaborated with Dr. David Clutton, who holds a PhD in the production of gin, and the result is something exceptional. The botanical recipe is simple: 3 fruits and 3 spices. It's a bright, fragrant, and elegant gin that is best experienced in a simple martini. Good stuff. And now it is my great pleasure to share with you my interview with Ronnie Cox.
I was born in 1954. You know, when people say to me, when you joined the company, I've been with Berry Brothers in Rudd, the suppliers of Glenrothes whiskey and Number 3 gin and King's Ginger and various other wonderful brands, for approximately 26 years.
Wow.
But before that even, I worked for 13 years for what is now Diageo. And when I say to people I started in it was probably in 1973. It was a very, very long time ago. And in those days I traveled Latin America, really cutting my teeth into what was then, a whole bunch of dictatorships down in that part of the world where 80% of the whiskey was consumed without any taxes or duties. So you were meeting very interesting people, and I reckon that by the end of 10 years working in Latin America, I could shake somebody by the hand and I could see whether or not I should do the deal or not.
Wow, that must have been crazy.
It was great fun, because you can imagine it was pretty Wild West down there. When people were not paying taxes in Brazil and Paraguay, there were all sorts of nefarious ways that whiskey managed to get into those markets. But of course we were selling it to people who were legitimate distributors in neighboring countries, and they would then hire ants or busloads of pensioners and so on to take the booze across the border into Brazil and various other countries like that. Anyway, that's where I cut my teeth.
What drew you to this industry to begin with?
Well, there's a little bit of family history that sort of involves me a little bit. So we have 7 generations of whiskey distillers in the Cumming family. That's my mother's family. 2 of those generations were illicit distillers, and they were fined. One was fined exactly 200 years ago. Last week was fined £200 and £300, which is the equivalent, I suppose, today of $75,000, $100,000, something like that, which he couldn't possibly afford because he only had 2 cows, 5 sheep, 3 children, and a house that he didn't even own, a bit of farmland, and of course an illegal distillery. But in time-honoured fashion, the Scots, of course, didn't really consider paying tax on what was the water of life to be an honest sport. So they knew that the taxes were probably not going to ever be seen again in Scotland, and they would probably find their way to the urban culture of either Edinburgh, Glasgow, or London. So avoiding taxes on whiskey was kind of normal in those days, and a bit of fun.
And how did you get involved with Berry Brothers in Rudd?
Well, I worked with Johnny Walker, Black and White, and various big brands of Scotch whiskey in Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, and then also in Europe, and then eventually around the world. And I could see that what was happening with Diageo was that they were planting people in markets. So they were buying up local wholesalers, local distributors, and they were then planting their own guys in those markets, or they found local people to run the businesses. And instead of traveling out of London, then I would be traveling probably based in the country. And being a specialist in Latin America, then I could see that I probably would be based in Latin America. And the options at the time were a few countries that weren't particularly stable politically, let me put it that way. And so I jumped ship and I went to Berry Brothers and Rudd, who were looking for somebody at the time to run Cutty Sark whiskey for them in Latin America. And it took me about 6 months to understand that nobody in Latin America would drink a light-coloured scotch. Everybody wanted a very dark-coloured scotch. So I went to the owner and said, would you mind just darkening the scotch up? He said, what? No, this is completely wrong. We would never darken our scotch. And he never has, not with Cutty Sark nor with Glenrothes, which I now proudly travel with around the world. And I am the sort of walking billboard now, I guess, for Berry Brothers and Rudd and the world of single malt whiskey.
For folks that aren't familiar with Berry Brothers and Rudd, how do you describe that organization?
That's pretty simple. It's the oldest wine and spirits merchant in Britain, possibly in Europe, maybe even in the world. It's been in the same building since 1698. That was 100 years before the word cocktail was invented. And in those days, there was no running water. It was open drainage up until the 1800s. But it's in the West End of London, near what we call the Royal Palaces today. The official palace is St. James's Palace, which is just 50 yards away from Berry Brothers and Rudd. And Buckingham Palace is just about 150 yards away. And the whole of the West End of London, which is full of people who are very well off, because to live that part of the world, you had to be well off. They are regular customers of ours, and we have about 20,000 active customers in and around London and what we call the home counties. You see, living in the West End of London meant that you were receiving the fresh air from the United States of America first. If you lived on the East End of London, the air had already passed through the industry and picked up smoke on the way through. So if you happened to live in the East End of London, you probably lived 10 years less, even in the 1800s,
Wow.
than somebody who lived on the West. So the prices in the West End of London went rocketing up, and still are, the highest prices probably in the world, along with, I suppose, New York, Paris, and Tokyo.
Now, where does the Glenrothes fit into the Berry Brothers and Rudd world?
Interestingly, when we developed Cutty Sark back in 1923, and no, I wasn't alive at the time, it was a kind of unusual brand. A lot of whiskies were around in those days, but there was no whiskey which was completely naturally coloured and no smoke in it. And Cutty Sark was launched really to appeal to the wine market, so the fine wine connoisseurs who like to drink whiskey before dinner, but would find it difficult to drink a smoky whiskey before dinner simply on the basis that smoke is retained on the palate. So if you were drinking fine wines afterwards, the fine wines would be tainted with the smoke that was retained on your palate. And about, 60 years later, the then deputy chairman of the company, a chap called Christopher Berry Green, decided that there was an emerging single malt market, and we didn't have a share of that. We had the blended market, that was fine with Cutty Sark whiskey, but we needed a stopgap in the single malt market, and that was evolving. And the single malt, I like to think the single malt drinkers are really thinkers. In the world of alcohol, both in wine and in spirits, you have those who are drinkers and those who are thinkers. You have the quaffers, if you like, and the connoisseurs. And single malt is definitely a thinking man's drink. And blended whiskies, which I love as well, is definitely a drinking man's drink. So there's nothing more pleasurable, I think, than a 6:30 or 7 o'clock evening whiskey and soda which is normally made with a blended whiskey and soda water and ice in it. But if you really want to savor something, and after a great dinner, a great conversation, pour yourself something really special in a proper glass. It has to be a tulip glass, and savor and enjoy the enormous flavors, variety, portfolio of flavors that you can find within the glass of complex whiskey like Glenrothes.
What inspires you about the Glenrothes as a single malt? It's such a unique whiskey because it has a tremendous amount of heritage as a distillery, but as a single malt brand, it has a decent amount of heritage, but it's also being discovered by a lot of drinkers for the first time. What's kind of your perspective on that?
Well, Alan, I think you've kind of said that, exactly as it is, because for years since 1879, when the first drops actually came off the still, it was recognized as one of the great distilleries in Speyside, and Speyside is a kind of home of Scotch whisky, really. It's the home of elegance in Scotch whisky, anyway. And very quickly, Glenrothes became known as one of the top sort of 4 or 5 distilleries in Scotland amongst all the master blenders for all the blends, and they would use Glenrothes to enhance their blends in the areas really of body and structure and texture, but also because of its fantastic fruitiness and elegance. So if you wanted something which was creamy and elegant and fruity, you added some more Glenrothes to your blend. If you wanted something which was slightly oilier and heavier or richer in style, then you took another distillery, a Macallan, perhaps. If you wanted something that was very light and aromatic, then you probably took a Glenlivet. And those 3 distilleries, Macallan, Glenlivet, and of course Glenrothes, grew big organically on the back of the blends. And it was really only in the 1970s when single malts came into their own a little bit in the United States of America, led by Glenfiddich and now Glenlivet, and obviously Macallan. And then more esoteric single malts, which are certainly, I would never call them beginners malts like Glenrothes and so on, have come into the market as the market has developed. People are looking for complex, balanced whiskies that have an enormous depth and complexity to them. And that's what we've been doing in very small quantities. So we haven't been able to expand around the world as more commercial single malts might do. We very much look at the connoisseur and say, where there is the connoisseur on wine, that's where we're going to be with Glenrothes. And every single expression that we produce for the Glenrothes today will have a certain emotion attached to it. It'll have a different, it'll share the same distillery character, obviously, but each expression will have a different flavor to it.
Now, there's been some big developments at Glenrothes in terms of the reserve collection and kind of reintroducing that. Can you tell me what's taken place with the reserves?
Yeah, Alan, as you probably remember, when we first started, it was a concept in 1994 that nobody else had in the Scotch whisky industry, and that was that we introduced only a range of vintages, and people said we were barking mad. Initially, after a couple of years, I began to question my own wisdom too on this, but inevitably people got onto the bandwagon. They understood the concept, particularly those who understood where Berry Brothers and Rudd had come from over the last 300 years and associations, very long-term associations with wine, Chateau, particularly in Burgundy and Bordeaux. So vintage was a concept which was completely natural to us, but not on the basis that one year was better than the other, but that we could produce variants of the house style, if you like, each year, depending on the casks that we played around with. The key thing really for whiskey is not the barley so much as time and provenance, so time and type of cask. And with wine, you're very much playing with time as a variable, because if you buy wines that you think might keep for 20 years, but actually have reached their peak after 10 years, it's a bit difficult to judge exactly when a wine is at its very best. Whereas with whiskey, we can guarantee that it's going to be at its best for a particular emotion. The second thing that we did was to look at vintages and say, well, look, in the world of wine, in the world of music, in the world of sensory evaluation and basically trying to get interesting or association of mood with wines or music or people or whatever, there is definitely an unwritten rule in the world of wine that a glass of champagne is very much an upper. It's a celebratory style of drink, where a glass of vintage port is very much a relaxer and a downer, if you like. And then right in between, you've got all these wonderful wines made of lots of different varieties of grapes. But they are what I call conversation styles. And in the world of Scotch whisky, I was determined to do exactly the same thing with Glenrothes. And so we have always, at one time, I have an uplifting vintage. We have one that's a relaxing vintage and one conversation vintage. Each one of those vintages will be different in style. And they run out pretty quickly because we only take 2% of the entire year's production. And that's it. We say, stop. That's it. So the other 98 goes into the blends. So they are going to be very special. They're very collectible now. And as the footprint of Glenrothes drinkers gets wider and wider, and then more people want the more rare vintages, and what happens is that the water finds its own level. But some of those lovely vintages that were not very popular in the States when we first launched it, 10, 15 years ago, can still be found in some of the old liquor stores, perhaps with their original price tag on them. In fact, I found a case just a couple of years ago, which I proudly bought. And of course, the price of that particular vintage, the 1972, had gone up 6 times since the shop had bought it. In value, it had run out, and so the price had gone up. The collectors had got onto it, and so on. But it was just one of my favorite drams, so I cracked a bottle there and then.
I think we've only scratched the surface of vintages because it's such a simple, authentic concept. But I mean, there's so many great non-vintage champagnes out there, and you can achieve great kind of styles by blending different things together to make a great non-vintage champagne. But it's nothing like a vintage champagne. The character, like that ability to capture the real essence of something and to apply it to single malt seems like such a natural thing to do.
Yeah, it works incredibly well. When we looked at it, we saw that there was a huge variety to be had out there. You see, most of the commercial single malts had to taste exactly the same every day. For us, that's kind of dull and boring. And in the world of wine, is if you take a Le Pen or Margaux or Rothschild or any of those lovely top premier cru wines, you're going to have a variety year in, year out. And for us, that is part of the magic of making whiskey, in the same way as it is of making wine. But on the other hand, you take a look at some of the greatest champagnes in the world, and they do have, for instance, Krug has one called Grand Cuvée, which is they're equally proud of as they are of their vintages. And they're holding back, part of the vintages from previous years and putting it with other vintages. And we learned from that and said, well, actually, when you run out of a vintage, there's nothing more disappointing than going back to your liquor store and finding that they haven't got it any longer. So what are you going to replace it with? You don't know anything else except for that vintage you've been buying for the last year or 2 years or whatever. And so we decided then what we would do is to take a sort of Grand Cuvée of Glenrothes, and it would be what we call our reserve collection. And these are ongoing. They're going to be consistently available and still there. We're only taking a maximum of 3% from a distillery a year to make even a reserve. But what we've done there is, again, appeal to those people who are really interested in the world of whiskey. It's the not necessarily the top end. You don't have to be really wealthy to drink Glenrothes, but you have to be, to really enjoy it, you have to be quite knowledgeable in the world of single malts to really appreciate them. And so what we've done is deconstruct what was a collection of various different casks which may make up a vintage, And we've taken them into the component parts, and we will use 3 different styles of a cask. One will be the ex-bourbon cask. One will be what we call an American wood sherry cask, so that's wood imported from the United States of America, normally the Ozark, and brought down to Jerez la Frontera, southern Spain, made into casks. And then seasoned with sherry for 18 months and then sent over to Scotland without any sherry in it, of course. And the third type, and actually the most expensive, comes from the sustainable forestry in northern Spain, in Cantabria, Galicia, Asturias, and around that area. And those woods are chopped down, or the trees are chopped down, sent down to Jerez la Frontera, again seasoned with sherry, and before being sent 18 months later up to Scotland.
Wow. And then in terms of the bourbon cask reserve and sherry cask reserve, what's going on with those?
So in the way of deconstruction, then we've obviously got the sherry cask, and that's just first fill sherries. So they are both American sherry and Spanish sherry casks. The bourbon cask is obviously just ex-bourbon cask, and that product is kosher as well. And then we have what we call the vintage reserve, and the vintage reserve is the collection of bourbon casks and sherry casks put together. And then we have another related edition, which is the peated cask reserve, and that we're really excited by. Both the sherry cask and the peated cask reserve have had huge accolades straight away, and I'm sure the bourbon cask reserve, now that it's in the States, will also have the same sort of response from people.
Can you talk me through the peated cask, the wood program on that specifically?
Unusually for us, we finished a 1992 vintage whiskey in a cask which comes, I can't name the distillery, but it comes from the Isle of Islay, which out of the 7 or 8 distilleries that are there, 80% are quite heavily peated or smoky liquid, and the smoke is retained by the cask. And so if you put your whiskey in our case, obviously you've got an elegant style of whiskey which picks up pretty quickly any third-party flavors. You've got to be careful that you don't leave it in the cask too long, otherwise it just becomes completely dominated, in this case by the peat reek or peat flavors. And in my view, a whiskey that is so dominated by peat smells is not really a great whiskey, because it's not demonstrating what the character of the distillery is all about, and that's really what you want. It's very easy to make a smoky whiskey. You just put them in smoky casks, or you make a smoky whiskey from the start. But really what you want is your distillery character to shine through. Most people find it very hard to be able to part the heavily peated whiskey and really understand what the whiskey's about underneath. I mean, it's habituation. It's called habituation. So you've got to just remember that smell of peat and try and park it and look for anything else underneath. It's not easy. But it's, we do it every day, because when you put a shirt on in the morning, you know that you're putting a shirt on, and your mind doesn't think about it for the rest of the day. That's habituating your mind to the fact that you're wearing clothes, and you don't have to think about it. Otherwise you go mad. You know? But with something like an alcohol which has so many wonderful flavors in it, that if it's just dominated by one particular flavor, I always think it's a shame. I mean, some people love it, but for me it's a shame. But this one has got this delicate kiss of the Islay smoke coming through. On the nose, it's very light, so you've got Glenrothes coming through the whole way. And there's an elegance of this, it's an old Glenrothes, 1992, as I say, so it's 24 years old. It's got a wonderful ethereal, from ether, aroma to it. Really exciting and really unusual, too. And then you've got this lovely kiss of Islay smoke. Of anybody who's been on a wonderful trawler, or worn one of a seaman's jersey, or those sort of old fisherman's jerseys, that sort of thing, will recognize the flavors and the lovely aromas that come from the whiskey itself.
And it's got to be an exciting addition for you to be able to work with, because we're seeing more kind of peat-influenced expressions come out of Speyside, which wasn't so much the case in the past, but it's a new kind of added depth to the region.
Yeah, it's coming back again. It's odd. I mean, a lot of it is done for marketing. There's no doubt about it. so you get an extra bottle on the shelf. But in our case, it's done because the demand is there, that people are saying, we love Glenrothes, we want to have a little bit of a line extension. Can we go back to what it was once upon a time? And we have legitimacy in the sense that the first association of any distilleries, I think, in Scotland was one between Bunnahabhain and Islay and Glenrothes back in 1887. So this is highly unusual to get a combination of two distilleries together. So for us to get an Islay whiskey associated with Glenrothes is again a complete natural. And we're just going back to those wonderful roots of the 1880s.
And going back to the vintages for a moment, as we've established, they're very finite and in limited quantities. Are there any vintage expressions of Glenrothes out right now that you feel are just absolutely can't miss for big-time whiskey drinkers?
Yeah, I think when you're buying, I mean, unfortunately, there aren't any 80s left. I mean, if you can find 88 in the marketplace, you'll be lucky. The prices have gone rocketing up now, so any 70s that you find in the market, try and buy up, especially if they're under $300 a time. Because they will, if you have a look online, in Europe now, they've gone way through the $500 mark. All vintages run out of Glenrothes because we're taking such a small quantity, and as I say, as the footprint gets bigger, more and more people want the vintages. So they run out pretty fast, and we can't turn on a tap, unfortunately. We just don't have the stock of 15, 20-year-old whiskey. So the 2001 right now is available and won't be available in another couple of years. So what I would always recommend people to do is to buy the 2001, which is absolutely delicious, by the way. It's more of a relaxing conversation style. So if you like drinking a single malt for a relaxing conversation with friends, that's the 2001. I always say buy 2 cases, that is, not bottles, because then at least you've got a stock of your favorite dram for a bit.
Indeed. And I'm curious, what really inspires you about whiskey culture these days? I mean, you've been around the industry and the culture for a while. You've seen a lot of trends come and go. What inspires you about your work and the things happening in the culture right now?
I think primarily that we really understand so little about it. Our friends, the Japanese, have been copying Scotch whiskey for over 100 years now. Have done incredibly well at it too. And I take my hat off to the Japanese. But the Scots have got a long way to go to be able to catch up scientifically, anyway, with the Japanese. But even then, with all the we got a bunch of scientists who are just studying the interaction between the spirit and the wood in Scotland, sponsored heavily by by ourselves and in the industry, and it's really interesting to see that we probably only understand about 40 or 50% of really what goes on in the cask.
Wow.
So, although I've spent probably 15 years with a passion for the effects of a cask on the whiskey, there's lots to be able to do with the type of wood, where it comes from, what particulars, the sunny side of the slope or the backs, the shady side of the slope. There's lots of that to experiment with. So I have been kind of conservative in the way in which we use the tools for Glenrothes, the existing tools for Glenrothes, rather than breaking the rules or bending the rules and trying to fast forward things. Mm-hmm. We've been very much more locked into trying to improve things with the tools we've got. So, and I always think that is the better way to do it. So you take a traditional way of doing something, you improve it, rather than saying, well, let's start from the other way around and have a look at it and see if we can fast forward it by using a special wood that's come in from the south of Russia or somewhere. So I think there are a couple of other things that have happened. One is that we still haven't discovered the mystery, so let's keep going at it. The second one is that we get an awful lot of, like it's happening in the States now with the craft brewers. You get craft distillers as well, and we get lots of craft distillers in Scotland. For years, it was considered to be impossible really to start up your own distillery, but the rules have been relaxed. And so people are allowed to have their own still now. It's tiny little stills. People know an awful lot about it now. So it's really exciting what's happening in the world of micro distilleries. I think the big boys have to take account of that, and I wouldn't consider ourselves as being a big boy, but I would certainly consider ourselves as being one that has enormous depth of knowledge in the world of whiskey. And I think we have, obviously, with that history, we have a huge amount to fall back on, whereas somebody starting up a new distillery, can read all they want about it. They've got to learn an awful lot about it, and I hope everybody, will come out with a distillery and a product which is really good. It doesn't always happen, I'm afraid. That's the way of life. But it's really exciting, I think, for the rest of us to see young distillers coming in, trialing different ways of distilling and so on. And you've got a wonderful malt distillery in the United States of America called Westland in Washington, and that is that's showing, I think, North America how you can make malt whiskey.
Today, from your perspective, where is Glenrothes' place in the pantheon of great whiskeys? When you go to the great whiskey bars of Chicago and London and New York, where is Glenrothes' place on the back bar and on those extensive lists of whiskeys?
Yeah, it's probably not in as many bars as we would possibly like. But again, it's to do with the number of markets we can approach and the amount of whiskey that we have available. And unfortunately, all the vintages are always rationed. Mm-hmm. So they're on limited and restricted release to countries until such times as we decide that we're going to produce a little bit more. When John Rudd, the owner of Berry Brothers and Rudd, said to me, Ronnie, let's develop this and have some fun doing it. But just remember, it's not for me, it's not for you, it's not for your children, it's for my grandchildren, this brand. So when you develop it, you're going to develop it with a great deal of forethought as to where you're going to position it. And it's not not necessarily just in marketing positioning, but it's also in terms of country positioning, regional positioning, what sectors you want to position it in, whether it's in the on-premise or the off-premise, and what sector within the on-premise do you want to position it in. So it came down to a lot of target marketing, if you like, mm-hmm. in that. And I think that for Glenrothes in the future, as we start to expand now with the reserves, it is considered now to be amongst a bunch of 10 top whiskies, and probably in the bunch of 4 or 5 really select whiskies, which are the more esoteric, more flavorful, more complex styles. So if you were to ask me if in 1852, with the classification of Bordeaux vineyards, if there was an equivalent in Scotch whisky, where would we be? I would say we were Premier Cru, along with 3 or 4 other distilleries in Scotland. But not many people know it. But interestingly, Alan, if you have a look at if you have a look at the distillery warehouses and you just measure the number of brand new casks we got in there, the small sizes, the big size, the sherry casks, the new bourbon casks we got in there, that are all marrying great Glenrothes for the future, you would be impressed. And I think that's one of the ways of measuring the future success of a distillery, is having a look at the wood policy that they've got in the distillery. That shows complete pride in the product and knowledge of how to improve the liquid to such a degree that it's going to come out and be still considered as, one of the top 10 in the world.
It seems like Glenrothes has been very blessed to have some of the greatest malt masters in the industry, really put their mark on the Glenrothes whiskey. Gordon Motion, a guy like John Ramsey, who's just an absolute legend in the industry. Can you talk about some of the influence that those guys have had on Glenrothes?
Absolutely. John looked after 7 or 8 distilleries' products, and he created several brands as well, and he had to maintain them, obviously. He was, as you rightly say, a legend. He and a wonderfully generous chap with his time as well. He was a Burns scholar, Robert Burns, our national poet in Scotland. And he also, when I had to give a little talk at for the launch of what we call the John Ramsey, one of his expressions, a legacy really, that he left behind when he retired a few years ago. I was digging up some information on him and found that he played the hind legs of a donkey in a children's pantomime at Christmas time, but bored with the darkness involved of bending his head over and under the hind legs of a donkey, he took a squeezy bottle, that's a detergent bottle, empty, and filled it up with water, and occasionally would lift his leg and squeeze the squeezy bottle and squirt the front row of screaming children. But on a serious note, he was on, and still is actually, goes to tasting panels. He does a lot of the competitions, and he educated Gordon Motion incredibly well. John was a chemist through and through, and he understood obviously the chemistry involved to a greater degree than most. And Gordon has benefited, I think, from being, his protege. And Gordon shot for Scotland. So you don't want to say that any of his expressions are not top notch. He's pretty accurate with the gun. He's come on and he has taken over and developed and has really, we've all benefited, I think, from his knowledge as well. Being part of this Scotch Whisky Research Institute, and along with one or two others, have had the foresight to really concentrate a huge amount of research and money in development of casks. There's no doubt that the Edrington Group with Highland Park, Macallan, and they own the Glenrothes distillery, but not the brand, which is owned by Berry Brothers and Rudd. They have really helped us to develop something which is very, very peculiarly good. And yeah, you're so right that Gordon Motion now is up there amongst the supremos in the world of single malt and blending prowess.
And I guess in closing, for me, the thing that always resonates about Glenrothes is the vintage. I love the concept. But the other thing is I love how Glenrothes has championed the idea of maturity. We've become so conditioned to expect a 12 or a 15 or an 18 on the bottle, but this idea of respecting the natural maturity of a bottle, can you explain that concept to people that might not be familiar?
Yeah, with wines, I was saying a little bit earlier, with wines, it's up to you really, with the great wines, to choose when to drink it, because it matures by itself, and it rather depends on the environment in which it's maturing. So you can't necessarily say that this wine is really good right now, it's reached its point of maximum maturity, because you really haven't got too much to compare it against, and you can't really say this wine now is 15 years old, go buy it, because it just, it's not in the culture of wine to do that. But with whiskey, it is considerably easier to tell when a whiskey is mature. And the shape of the Glenrothes bottle actually is derived from a sample bottle in a distillery. And what would that sample bottle contain but a sample of whiskey from a group of casks which perhaps should have been mature but wasn't for some reason or other. So we would put a label on that sample bottle to say, like a school report, could do better, come back in a couple of years' time. And we'd revisit that group of casks and compare it against the sample that we had taken 2 or 3 years before, just to make sure that those casks now had produced the whiskey which is at its absolute top of maturity. Now, maturity in the world of whiskey was not what sold whiskey. What sold whiskey, as you rightly said, was age. And age is important, but it's not nearly as important as the environment in which it's grown up. If you happen to have 2 18-year-old kids, one is lucky enough to go to university, goes on, does an MBA. The other one has to go out through force and circumstances and look after the family, and it's harder for that person to make it to the top. They can do it. It's just harder. In the world of whiskey, it's considerably easier. as it is in life, if they are educated and go through the proper formal education. In the case of whiskey, of course, what we call the education is the environment, is the upbringing, is the cask I'm talking about here. And it's very much easier to make a great whiskey from a great cask than it is out of one that has been used 2 or 3 times. Now, the other important point to make here for somebody who is just getting into the world of whiskey is that when somebody offers you a 50-year-old whiskey, you have to question whether they've tried it or not beforehand. And never buy a bottle of 50-year-old whiskey until you've actually tried it and you like it. Unless you want to buy somebody's 50th birthday present, for instance. But even then, you're paying top dollar for something that may not be to your taste. Because inevitably, if it's been in good casks for 50 years, the taste of the cask will dominate the taste of the distillery flavors. And that, to me, is a shame. You know, when you start off on the right-hand side with the wood, on the left-hand side with the spirit, and you bring them together down like a pendulum swinging down to the middle there. The bit in the middle, the bottom sort of 45 degrees of that 360-degree pendulum swing, if you could imagine that, the bottom 45 degrees is where the influence of the wood and the influence of the spirit have come together in perfect harmony. And that hasn't got an age statement on it. That can be anywhere between 8 and perhaps 25 years old. To get a 50-year-old whiskey, you can, if you like woody casks and woody whiskey, old brandies, old Armagnacs, old rums, old whiskies, they tend to converge together in flavor profile because the wood is having such an influence on it. To me, the real fun is seeing that distillery character there and how it's been influenced by the wood without being too woody and without being too spirity. So it's somewhere right in the middle. And that, to me, is maturity. And that, for Glenrothes and Berry Brothers and Rudd, is why age was not important. Then everyone said we were mad when we came out with what we now call a non-age statement. But in those days, it was Select Reserve, or what we call today Vintage Reserve. It had no age statement on it. But I knew that the whiskies in there were between 8 and 15 years old. And I knew that it also had a taste profile of a 12 to 15-year-old whiskey, a combination of casks there. Because we can today, Glenrothes, produce, in many instances, a 12 to 15-year-old tasting whiskey with considerably less time by using smaller casks and better casks. And that's what we've learned. You know, we've learned more in the last 40 years about maturation than we did in the previous 500.
Wow.
Doesn't mean to say you can accelerate it, but you can certainly improve things to the degree where you get tremendous depth and not just accelerating it just for the sake of accelerating it without the depth. And you can do that as well, but that's no game. The real game is maintaining the complexity of a whiskey through the use of good wood. And then the cask selection, because each cask is going to be different too. So you think you've got wonderful casks to start off with, and 10 years, 15, 20 years later, 2 or 3 of them don't produce what you hope they produce. Really interesting world, this whiskey world. And I have spent a lifetime in it, and I wish I had another one. Because I reckon that, you know, people your age and younger even will discover even more about whiskey. Secondly, I think that, you know, it's an industry here for the future because it is so complex, it's so much fun, it's so sociable, and it hasn't yet been discovered. You know, it's not a simple world. It's not just fermenting sugary water. This is using so many different elements to it, and there's always something exciting around the corner.
Well, you're a people's champion, and I know you've influenced a tremendous amount of people and inspired them, and I appreciate you taking the time to share some stories tonight, and I look forward to many more adventures to come.
So do I, Alan. They say that if you drink Glenrothes, you live forever and never die, and the doctors and churchyards go out of fashion. So I'll be around, I hope.
There we go.
Time.
Yes, we'll test it. I love it.